Great, thank you, Amy. For our next panel, we will be joined by Colonel Sang Han, who is the Chief of Infrastructure at the DoD's Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, as well as Edmond Kuqo, who is the lead DevOps systems engineer at the Naval Information Warfare Center, for a discussion on how the armed forces and the DoD are using DevSecOps to facilitate the adoption of new technologies and advance America's warfighting preparedness. Edmond and Colonel Han, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Adam, thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
Great to have you both. As kind of an opening question for Colonel Han, in terms of your experience with the JAIC thus far, what do you think the DoD really needs to get right about its infrastructure to unlock the greatest benefits from the adoption of AI?
Yeah, Adam, I think being able to replicate infrastructure quickly and securely that is easily repeatable is what we have to get right. You know, just like any scientific research study, we want to be able to reproduce those conditions of an environment that AI developers can easily develop capabilities, with a common set of tools and infrastructure, so that developers and users will have the confidence that the capability will work either in a development or in production. And how do we ensure we get that infrastructure configured correctly? We leverage infrastructure as code and configuration as code to quickly build this infrastructure that is easily repeatable and transparent. So what sometimes took weeks to build an infrastructure and configure each asset that may not have been easily reproducible is now easily reproducible with infrastructure and configuration as code, and can be easily established within minutes to hours instead of the old approach that could take days and weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that really expedites the development process and really cuts down on kind of the deployment time. A bit of a similar question for Edmond, and this is kind of a broader security and your approach to that. What is the importance of security in this kind of development environment that is really working to adopt and scale new and emerging tech?
Very well question there. So in general, many commercial applications must undergo through a rigor and modification process prior to being usable in the government setting. A lot of times, this particular process is the risk management framework to assess the importance as well as what type of information these tools or systems will handle within a government infrastructure. I would like to emphasize, though, a little on the process, because you mentioned AI earlier. And it is important to know that in certain environments or use cases that AI is important to replicate and, of course, speed a lot of these security false positives that usually take place and requires a lot of the manual interactions with a larger workforce to evaluate. It's also imperative that when products and services are designed, right, we need to ensure that they include requirements specifically on the government side, right? Industry, there is a wealth amount of or high bandwidth. There is a high infrastructure availability. In government, we need to be mindful about low bandwidth as well as air-gapped and disconnected infrastructure. And a lot of times the industry utilizes this high availability environmental infrastructure as well as high bandwidth design models that when same tools that were designed on the industry side operated successfully, when they are introduced to low bandwidth and disconnected infrastructure, they become challenging and problematic in a way, right, where the government then has to spend extra cycles to re-update the architecture or to reintroduce different design and deployment models, right, to successfully deploy on such low constrained environments. I just wanted to take it a little step further by just promoting, not promoting, but emphasizing to the industry and a lot of the vendors that produce products that the military or the government utilizes for delivering mission capabilities is that a lot of times a product from the industry is sold as is, out of the box as the cut solution that works and supposed to meet your mission capabilities. We take those same product and try to deploy it, as I mentioned earlier, in these low bandwidth, very secure environments. And that same product that worked flawlessly on the industry infrastructure no longer can be deployed, let alone meet the minimum capabilities that the product offered. So I'm encouraging the industry by following, the National Institute Standards and Technology, right, on NIST, the 853 and their related documents, to build these products with that mindset and those requirements in mind for low bandwidth, intensively and heavily secured infrastructure as well as air-gapped environments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can imagine that there is a certain degree of translation that needs to happen when you're taking something that has been developed in the private sector and is being applied to now the government, especially the armed forces. And I have kind of a similar question for the Colonel as well. And in terms of the work that you are undertaking at JAIC right now, how are you working to ensure that AI architecture is safe and secure? And how is DevSecOps driving that? Because it sounds like with the adoption of new technology, there are some potentially unaddressed kind of security areas that need to be ascertained.
Yeah, no, the DevSecOps principles is in everything that we do to ensure that the AI architecture is safe and secure. From an AI ML perspective, from data ingest, where we need to ensure the integrity and the safety data that can be done through hash and malware checks, to model development with test and evaluation, validation, verification capabilities, along with explainable AI considerations. And then to the application development that follows your traditional DevSecOps processes supporting CI/CD. The key piece, I think, is going to be really automating the pipeline across the data ingest, the model development, and the applications development, with a DevSecOps approach to provide the transparency to the end users that to really be able to trust the AI capabilities using a common DevSecOps architectural framework. And so that whole process is in our planning consideration to implementation of everything we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I'm kind of curious that emerges from that, in terms of the lessons learned thus far, in terms of undertaking these pretty substantial modernization and new tech adoption projects, what have been some of the challenges you've noticed for both of your organizations in integrating DevSecOps within your development processes? Edmond?
Again, that's a very well questions there. I just wanted to emphasize again this notion that there is a large amount of tools and services available from the industry, right, that tend to focus in different areas, based on the requirements that in the government setting, that in order for us to support the mission owners. And by no means, I want to emphasize, I'm not an artificial intelligence subject matter expert, right? But the same concepts apply to traditional deployments of applications and the lesser learns with the cloud adoption. And I'm going to give an example just simply to demonstrate, to the audience, the complexity, even from a simple hello world application. A requirement would constitute state that I need a hello world application to go to a production system for access by the field operators or the mission users. That particular requirement has to go, of course, the traditional acquisition process that we currently follow on DoD, and pushing towards more of an agile delivery model and practices. In that particular area, following now we have to identify, the security controls. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the NIST guidelines, the 853, and the application security documentation to make sure that all the security controls are applicable. And the product that is being built from the development, right? There is this discussion between DevOps and DevSecOps, right? Depending on who you talk to, DevOps security shall be or implies as baked in. With the DevSecOps is more emphasized, and we're trying to train our workforce as well as promote this culture of shift security left from the design all the way to operations and production delivery. From a lesson learned, as I mentioned, that same concept in industry from a hello world perspective, someone can have that application deployed using some open source tools, in less than an hour or 2 hours. From an infrastructure perspective and a government setting, you need to consider a lot of the low bandwidth constraints, secure tools, products and services that you need access to, as well as learning how to access these environments, make sure that your workforce is trained on those particular standards as well as tools in order for you to deliver this capability. So we are taking note, working and partnering with the industry in terms of how they're doing from a best practice perspective in the industry side, as well as we're trying to repeat the model, agile, DevSecOps, following, and as the Colonel mentioned, right, machine language, artificial intelligence, even though there's challenging on the government setting, because again, you have got a lot of the security controls that impeding in a way, not for any wrong reasons, but they have to be there, given we deal with weapon systems and mission critical and cost of life. So we're learning and we're trying to pass in that lesson learned to our workforce, right, and training them with materials that can necessitate and enable us that agility for delivering those capabilities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like training and a real big cultural shift is a necessary part of this process. Colonel Hahn, in terms of the work that's been done at the JAIC, how are you within the DoD really working to foster a DevSecOps culture?
Okay. Yeah, no, it's, just to add on to what Edmond mentioned, about the DevSecOps culture. I see the DevSecOps culture, building the synergies, among developers, cybersecurity professionals, and the operation maintainers to really kind of work together to quickly provide a capability the warfighters can trust and use. And the culture will require people to understand the new processes and policies to enable the rapid delivery of these capabilities leveraging DevSecOps. And you have to get buy-in from both the developers, the cybersecurity folks, because it's almost a very new paradigm in the sense of getting the two together so that we don't just pass things across the fence. And then you add just additional cycle times, and we're trying to reduce that cycle time by, as Edmond mentioned, educating the workforce on both the developers and the cybersecurity professionals to really understand how this paradigm is going to deliver capabilities much faster to the warfighters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm imagining that knowledge sharing is a really big part of that as well. And it makes you wonder, are you currently pursuing or planning on pursuing knowledge sharing both within the DoD and across the armed forces as a whole to really foster a greater DevSecOps adoption?
Yes. So as we talk about the DoD DevSecOps reference design, that was released back in August of 2019. It's a little less than 2 years old, but even from when that was developed and released, the DoD's had a DevSecOps community of interest and practice. So a lot of the senior officials have come together as we talk about educating the workforce of this new process. How do we, I think last I recall, there were about 6 or 7 different lines of efforts to really enable adoption of DevSecOps. So in the overall department, there are processes and working groups in place to really accelerate the adoption as part of this knowledge management and training. And then now it's really, as we develop that knowledge and the capabilities and then really start working on implementation and putting it into practice, I think we're on a pretty good road path to that.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly impactful and really promising in terms of accelerating the process and broader, government modernization within the armed forces broadly. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which is in terms of the ultimate impact of these technologies and how they will play out over the longer term, how do you see DevSecOps and the adoption of emerging tech as really important for maintaining and advancing U.S. national security?
So it's very difficult to keep up with all the great technologies that are being developed every day, and we need to look at ways in adopting these new technologies ahead of our adversaries and competitors to really have the next unfair advantage. As Edmond mentioned, as industry is building a lot of these capabilities and trying to put that into trying to have the DoD use those capabilities. There's a lot of security protocols to make sure that it can operate in a secure environment. And so DevSecOps, as we socialize the requirements to industry, it's going to be an important capability really to adopt and implement these new capabilities within the DoDs, at speed.
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Colonel's point, right? One more note that it is imperative, right, that collectively finding that median between industry or commercial products, and the government, right? We need to find that relationship that when the industry builds these products, it builds these products not simply, with a requirement of having everything available to you, but when we are truly constrained. Infrastructure constraint, bandwidth constraint, security controls, that definitely are a key and play an impact and a critical role, when these troops and our, operators are in the mission in a completely different environment in terms of talking about artificial intelligence or autonomous vehicles, right? A lot of these products are built with, again, with a large amount of data available and the models that are being built through MBSE model-based systems engineering. But then you go in the field and you go in the terrain that actually doesn't conform to a lot of these models, and this GPS can be, abstracted by the, enemy. Then a lot of these tools that greatly work become so problematic in the operational field that we have to truly start rethinking on how the vendors, the industry, and government works or orchestrates these requirements from the get-go. Over.
Absolutely. And that's to touch a bit on what you mentioned about the relationship between the private sector and facilitating adoption within the armed forces. Edmond, how do you see DevSecOps as potentially really securing and kind of bridging the gap between the armed forces and the DoD as a whole and America's defense industrial base?
Interesting. So I'm gonna quote Socrates here, and he said, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." As you folks are aware, currently we do follow, and we're pushing forward to bridge that gap between a traditional old acquisition procurement process, right? When you start with your regular, acquisition phases. Do your traditional milestones reporting, you do your setter events and things of that nature into more of an agile and DevSecOps culture, through the software factory model. Now, that being said, right, I keep sidelining or focusing on the industry. It is imperative that even though the government does build a lot of their customized software and their organically grown solutions, but we depend heavily as well on the industry side, on the code, products. And in order for us to build and adopt a more, agile and automated way of delivering these capabilities, we need to ensure that from a infrastructure perspective, the infrastructure is available, right, as the mission needs it. And the Colonel mentioned earlier that we want to be able to replicate our infrastructure, using different technologies or tool sets. And the recent or the latest buzzword, if you call it, is this zero trust, architecture, ZTA, right, where we are currently focusing on the VPN access, where a user gain access to the entire area once they connect to the VPN or the infrastructure versus a dedicated line for that particular area that the user or the mission, the field operator needs access to. It's really hard, to discuss DevSecOps and agile practices in a 30-minute discussion, to be honest, or for that matter, how do we secure products and services. But if I can say one thing as a recommendation to the industry is that if we, the government, procures your service or your product or your tool, it takes us a large amount of effort as well as teams to actually review and assess all of the security protocols of your application, following those NIST guidelines and, the DSAS requirements in terms of the, ASDSRGs, right, which is the security guidelines. If the product that's being produced by the vendor or the commercial industry should not depend on the government to do this review and assess their security posture, right? I understand that the products that the industry builds are secure by definition, but again, trust by, verify at the end. So I'm encouraging the industry and the product vendors to actually download those checklists from the DSI on their cybersecurity site, and actually before they sell this product to the government, make sure that these products or these documents are part of the procurement process. So then when we get these products, those lists are up to date at the moment they're produced. So then we'll save the government, critical time for us to actually focus on delivering and integrating these capabilities rather than reassessing what the product does and if it's secure by definition. Over.
Absolutely. And it sounds like it really both facilitates adoption and allows you to more carefully meet and counter potential security threats to make sure those are patched up well in advance. A question I want to ask you, Colonel, is something that that Edmond brought up, which is that in terms of DevSecOps and how it impacts the utilities available within the armed force and the DoD as a whole, how do you see the more rapid and secure adoption of AI ultimately benefiting the American warfighter and those who are deployed to the field?
Yeah, no, it's it's similar to with the U.S. National security interests. Is again, we know our competitors are investing in rapidly developing AI capabilities, and the American warfighter will need the trusted AI capabilities developed so that and delivered to them, so that when the American warfighters are called upon for a mission, that they will have that advantage to achieve their objectives. So, and as we talk about, how do we deliver those capabilities? Edmond talked about with industry and delivering those capabilities with security in mind, and it's absolutely true. If the developers or the industry don't know the left and right limits, we see all these awesome capabilities in development environment, and then when you put it into the government network, it doesn't work. And we spend days, if not weeks, with the developers and the engineers trying to figure out why those capabilities aren't working in production, and not realizing that some of those ports or protocols that the capabilities developed in development are closed in the production environment, and maybe they didn't know what those controls or protocols were, and so now we're justifying as to why we need a certain port or a service open, or the developers has to reconfigure those capabilities to go on an open port. And additionally, as if these developers don't have the security in mind, when they develop, how do we entrust the integrity of the data in their environment when building AI/ML capabilities? Compromised data easily leads to the compromised machine learning models into production, and then the data owners won't trust sending their data into this development environment or an industry, and without reliable data, you really can't build reliable and trusted AI/ML capabilities.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. This is Edmond. Again, I challenge a lot of the industry folks is that if you truly want your product to be ready for adoption in the government, try to build at the very least FIPS compliant systems, right? Because a lot of products are built in the industry side, and to Colonel's point, we bring them in the government side, and the moment we turn FIPS on encryption, you get the answer to that tool that won't even start, let alone operate at its capability that was designed for. So it is imperative to emphasize again Colonel's comment that the development on the industry, by any means, I mean, as the commercial side doesn't take security serious. I just mean that looking at the NIST guidelines and following the DSA checklist and the STIG, guidelines, it will definitely remove a lot of that overhead time we spend, and it's very expensive on the government side when it comes to trying to review these products. And given that they're COTS by definition, I don't have access to your source code. Like, how am I going to answer a question if your TCP connection, or if you're doing actually SSL encryption and all that without having access to your source code? So now I have to send you an email. I need to ask that question, to your product, to the vendor. They wait a day or two or a week sometimes. So again, I just want to emphasize that it is very important that we build the systems with security and constraint and bandwidth, low bandwidth in mind. Over.
Yeah, and just and getting that delivered at speed to the warfighter is imperative, because they're the ones that are going to be using it to have that unfair advantage.
Absolutely, and it really does sound like building secure development practices from the get-go is essential, because it sounds like potential security vulnerabilities really can cascade downward in ways that are somewhat risky, so good to see those are being sort of really smoothed over from the start. As kind of a concluding question and as an overview question, this of course is probably way too broad to even be addressed in 30 minutes, let alone 3 hours, but going forward, how do you see a DevSecOps culture really facilitating the adoption of future technologies across the armed forces as a whole? How does that really set a strong baseline for the next 5, 10, even 20 years?
There are many different flavors on what constitutes value or a successful delivery, or for that matter, a successful outcome. It takes a combination of different tools, services, platforms, frameworks, processes, strategies, policies, and most of all, money, right? And, the people need to work in orchestration, and all of these combined together and following a repetition and a maturity model, right? You then define this software factory model, right? So that software factory that utilizes all these DevSecOps, all these tools and integration, as well as the agile, philosophy, to ensure that we then deliver value to the mission owner and the capabilities. We are all, of course, throughout the DoD, and I don't want to speak for the entirety of the DoD, but as a Navy civilian, we're working closely with our leadership to build these relationships and collaborate with different branches across the DoD. So then, not to reinvent the wheel, right, but to reuse a lot of these products and services that are ready for use in the government. For example, if a given tool or service already has an authority to operate, right, which is that application has been assessed, then rather than me me going through the entire risk management framework process, I can actually reuse, given that's already been established as an ATO program within the DoD. But again, that requires additional level of effort in terms of reciprocity if these products can be used across branches because they have different network settings and requirements. So as a closing note, holistically, we continue to push and promote this culture that strives on transparency, collaboration, where change and feedback is welcomed and not criticized, right? Regardless of that feedback, if it's bad, not as in bad feedback, but critical feedback to your success story. By accepting this feedback, early and often, and empowering our future workforce and the adoption of these successful software factories, and by embedding the operators and the field users as part of this collaboration and this feedback mechanism, I'm pretty sure that we will continue to push for delivering these capabilities at the mission of at the speed of mission need. Over.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Colonel Hahn, do you have anything to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add from an operational perspective. I remember when I was deployed a while ago, as we're trying to make changes to an application, we waited 6 months for an update, while we were in deployed doing a mission. And 6 months is just not acceptable. And this DevSecOps culture is what we need to really help facilitate from development to operations, delivering that at mission speed.
Absolutely. Well, Edmond and Colonel Hahn, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you. Glad to be here.
Our next panel will feature a discussion on how federal agencies are adopting DevSecOps to build more resilient IT systems and to improve business recovery.